Hey everybody, it's Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and since we're about halfway through the year at this point, I think it's about time we did a top 10 movies of the year so far. Just a little halftime top 10 for 2023. Starting from the bottom and working our way up, at number 10, Sheen Ultraman, written and produced by fantasy maverick Hideaki Anno and directed by his frequent collaborator Shinji Higuchi. This will be out on Blu-ray and digital this July, but had a special two-night-only premiere in theaters at the beginning of the year. Obviously, this is something of a spiritual follow-up to Anno's previous reimagining of a classic Japanese fantasy character, Shin Godzilla, and while there are some shared themes and stylistic parallels, this is ultimately a very different but just as interesting movie. The thing that really grabbed me about this movie is how it basically turned out to be one of the most refreshing superhero movies that I've seen in years. The structure of it is extremely weird because it basically doesn't feel like it's its own self-contained movie. It plays more like what we're seeing is just a very abridged version of an entire imaginary Ultraman series. What I really loved about it is that Anno and Higuchi basically didn't approach this as a conventional superhero action movie, but as a fantasy sci-fi that aims for something more bizarre and uncanny, sometimes tongue-in-cheek, but I also really liked that the film doesn't very often go for laugh-out-loud sense of humor or like it's parodying or poking fun at classic fantasy. It really does just sort of commit to its own really strange aesthetic and sort of invite the audience to indulge in it for its own sake. And in a year where Avatar 2 was cleaning up at the box office, I do have to say that I also love the special and visual effects work in this movie, because part of the whole amazing, bizarre style of the movie is that Higuchi and Anno also don't seem to aim for naturalism. You get the sense that they're harnessing very contemporary visual effects in order to achieve a look that is so distinct and otherworldly in that it ironically invokes the feeling of watching something from another time, where you can see the textures of paint on the Ultraman costume. You feel like the skylines look like studio backdrops. It's also meticulous and detailed in its own way, but going for something that is so unique and out of sync with the contemporary obsession with making everything hyper-realistic. It's a little long in the tooth, and I think Higuchi as a director kind of has a penchant for going overboard in terms of editing together so many highly stylized shot compositions that don't necessarily really help to tell the story. But overall, I still think this is one of the most fascinating and original films I've seen this year. And again, if you're kind of experiencing some fatigue from American superhero movies, this is one to keep an eye out for when it gets a more mainstream release at the beginning of next month. Number 9, Airbound, an avant-garde documentary by projectionist, archivist, and filmmaker Leandro Listorti. I first talked about this one in my Master Gardener episode of the New Movie Diary, but I really can't wait to see this one again because I only saw it at its New York premiere in March of this year, and it's still doing the festival rounds. This is a really stark, meditative, and beautiful movie in which Listorti draws upon both contemporary and archival work in order to tell a very free associative story about the relationship between preservation and history, between our sense of history and national identity, about the contradictions between attempting to educate the public and portraying ideal versions of a subject. This is definitely a very cerebral movie, but it's also a very visceral film because besides Listorti's own visual composition of the film, sound designer Roberta Einstein's work here is so tactile and musical in and of itself that you sometimes want to just close your eyes and listen to it all on its own. Number 8, The Year Between, written, directed by, and starring Alex Heller. I already had this in my top 5 films from the first quarter of the year, and it's still sitting pretty here in the bottom half of the top 10, and in a year that is turning out to be extremely promising for up-and-coming women filmmakers. This is out on VOD right now, and while it at first seems like it's on the milder side of the quirky indie dramatic comedy, I think anybody who hasn't seen it yet is going to be pleasantly surprised by just just how acerbic and pessimistic Heller's vision turns out to be. And not pessimistic in a negative way, but pessimistic in a weird, good way where she's not trying to pull any punches about her subject matter and really tries to go out of her way to subvert our expectations about how these sorts of stories about mental health and family dysfunction are supposed to play out. Number 7, also safely sliding into a top 10 slot from its place on my top 5 from the first quarter of the year, Jamie Dack's Palm Trees and Power Lines. A little clunky when it's first starting off, but stick with it. This is a really grueling, disquieting, and uncomfortable movie that is brilliantly shot by Dack and cinematographer Chananun Chatrangroj that I think of partially as being kind of a really much-needed inoculation to so many more lascivious and exploitative youth in revolt movies, especially youth in revolt movies about teenage girls. And like I said in my first quarter video, this one comes with a content warning for themes of the grooming of a minor, and the ending is completely devastating. This is not a parable of self-empowerment that gets wrapped up in a clean little bow, but it's well worth sticking through. Number 6, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, Kelly Freeman Craig's wonderful adaptation of the seminal middle-grade novel by Judy Blume about an 11-year-old girl navigating moving to a new school and making new friends and learning about her body and coming into her own as a free-thinking and independent person. This movie was utterly screwed over by the Motion Picture Association, which saddled it with a PG-13 rating because apparently a movie that frankly and non-patronizingly depicts what it's actually like to go through early female puberty is just too touchy of a subject for actual young girls to deal with. It really is just such a simple and stark confirmation of how puritanical we still are as a society, despite superficial signifiers to the contrary. And it's unfortunate because besides being a really good movie, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret is just a really good kids movie. Craig does a really good job of orchestrating this adaptation, which strikes just the right balance between formal sophistication and just plain, direct drama that even very young kids can wrap their heads around and come away feeling as if the filmmakers have taken them seriously as an audience that is ready for adulthood, ready to be more mature and treated more maturely as an audience, and not simply pandered to and talked down to and handled with kids' gloves by so much screamy, farty CGI garbage. Craig also does a really good job of telling the parallel story of Margaret's mother in the story and her own adjustments to her new life and her daughter's increasing maturity and independence. And as far as performances go, and while I don't want to distract from the young cast on display here, I think Rachel McAdams might give one of the best performances of the year so far. She's absolutely stunning in this movie as the mother of Margaret. Number 5, Stonewalling from Hwang Ji and Ryuji Otsuka. U.S. distributor Kim Stim Films still hasn't lined up a definitive release for this one as it continues to play special engagements throughout the year, the next of which will be at the Cleveland Cinematheque at the end of this August. Another safe holdover from the first quarter of the year. I'm sort of starting to reckon with how many of the best films I saw this year were ones I saw fairly early in the year, but if you see Stonewalling, I think you'll immediately begin to understand why it made such a big impression on me, which was not even necessarily an immediate impression. It's definitely one of those movies where it's so observational and meditative that you feel kind of divorced from what's going on for so much of it, even as you're fascinated by all the directions in which the narrative goes. But it's really only after you see it and after you really sit with another really devastating ending to one of this year's new movies, it's only really after you see it and sit with it you discover just how much of an emotional gravity that it has, how much all of these things that it shows you and that it portrays so starkly and frankly really do weigh on your mind without you even really noticing it at first. Number 4, Earth Mama, written and directed by Savannah Leaf, which I'm delighted to relate will be getting a release courtesy of A24 in the first week of next month, this July. So definitely pay attention for that. This is an excellently directed film that, unlike a lot of A24's more neo-realistic acquisitions, doesn't rely on a high concept, doesn't rely on establishing a really manic momentum with a ticking clock sort of narrative, but is really just all about living in the world of these characters with wall-to-wall great performances, especially by Erica Alexander and newcomer Tia Namor in the starring role. She's fantastic in this movie. Number 3, One of These Days. This one really came out of left field for me because it had its international premiere all the way back in 2020 at the Berlin International Film Festival and only just got a limited US release this April and is now on video on demand. Taking place in a small town in Texas, although the film was actually shot on location in Louisiana, One of These Days is an ensemble drama that concerns a hands-on-a-hard body competition in which various folks attempt to win a new pickup truck by being the last one with their hands on the vehicle after several days of going without sleep and never moving. And perhaps it goes without saying, while that may strike you as a rather benign and parochial subject, One of These Days really ends up being an exploration about how the sorts of things that we tend to see as just kind of the eccentric spectacles on the margins of American society, how they can really become little microcosms unto themselves about how desperate so many people are and how prone we are to exploit that desperation, even when the people doing the exploiting basically have no self-awareness of what they are doing until everything starts to go slowly, precipitously awry. And what's amazing about this is that, besides Louisiana doubling for Texas, this is actually primarily a German production. It was written and directed by one Bastian Gunther, whose films tend to show a deep fascination with America, and I suppose it's somehow appropriate that it takes a foreign filmmaker on the outside looking in on us like reptiles in a herbarium to really take a movie that feels so definitively American. But yeah, One of These Days, incredible little film that I don't really see anybody talking about and that I would recommend putting up high on your must-see lists. Number 2, Our Father the Devil, another entry that still doesn't have a firm release date yet. Ellie Fumbi's wonderful, emotionally whiplashing, at times disturbing, and at times psychologically hysterical feature film debut starring Babatita Sajo and Suleimansi Savane in 2 incredible central performances. If you guys have already seen my first new movie diary on this film, you already know how much I really loved it. Such a unique and distinct picture, and with an ending that is so powerful and spiritual, and something that I'll likely continue to sing the praises of, even as I desperately keep checking my watch to find out if U.S. distributor Cinedigm finally gives it a definitive limited release date before Fandor ends up getting it for video on demand release, and it ends up going behind their subscription paywall. Finally, number 1, and yes, this is still my favorite movie of the year after first giving it the number 1 slot back in March when I did my first quarter top 5. This is still, so far, in my opinion, the best movie I've seen all year, Daniel Antaby's God's Time. Now, is God's Time a perfect debut for Antaby? Absolutely not. In fact, I think I'd say that there are some parts of it that are made with so much verve and enthusiasm that it comes off a little showboaty, a little cringe, goes a little overboard. But at the same time, I think overall, besides being so tightly scripted for as wild as the narrative is, besides being so eccentrically stylized, but mostly never really alienating you from the character focus of the film, you've also got to hand it to the 3 leads, Ben Groh, Dion Costello, and Liz Carabell. The chemistry these 3 have is insane, and Antaby seems to realize that they're the ultimate key to making this funny, bleak, twisted odyssey come off as well as it does. This is still on video on demand, it's still out there, and I'm still waiting for more people to get hip to this movie. It really stole my heart. I want as many people as possible to see it and appreciate it as much as I do. God's Time, man. Saw this all the way back at the end of February, and this is still my favorite movie of the year so far, and it is a tough act to beat as far as I'm concerned. I think that's good, though obviously I got a whole laundry list of films I still need to see, films I'm still looking forward to, but you guys tell me, what am I missing out on? What's your top 10 looking like? What are your slam dunks of the year so far? Let me know. Like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. I am Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and I hope you all have a pleasant second half of your movie year. Cheers, everybody.